Video lesson 6.2, the Korean War. So this video lesson we're going to kind of fill in the blanks a little bit. We're going to leave Asia for the time being and move on to Latin America next class, but there are kind of some important parts of the Korean War that are significant just to know because it's part of American history, because it's part of world history, and it pertains to the Cold War. So we're going to kind of overview the Korean War really quickly. It only lasted 3 years. And at the end of it, we'll kind of see why it's not really that significant in terms of the war. But it is significant in that it is the first proxy war of the Cold War. So this represents kind of a new phase in the Cold War. So just to kind of familiarize you with these terms. So I'm sure you've heard of the term of a third world country. So these were typically, or you might have heard of like hashtag first world problems. The first, second, and third world are, we don't often talk about the second world, but we're going to talk about it today, were terms coined by a French demographer in 1952. So this is actually during the Korean War when that happens. The first world is the countries you see here in green. So Australia, Western Europe, and America and Canada. Countries that guarantee individual freedoms, democratic elections, private property, capitalism, and Christianity usually. And these are modern and prosperous countries in 1952. The countries that he deemed Second World were marked by the complete subjugation or subordinance of the individual to the state, collectivism, official atheism, genocide, and enormous human suffering. So these are countries run by a dictator usually. They don't really have a rule of law. It's rule of the ruler. They're not as industrialized or progressive as the first world countries. So these are also the communist countries, namely the USSR, which includes all of this territory in 1952. Remember, these areas here are part of the USSR, as well as China. Okay? And then the third world is where the poorest of primitive peoples lived, he said, with the daily features of hunger, malnutrition, disease, filth, and misery. Many of these countries weren't even countries in 1952 because they were still imperial territories of the Western European powers. Yes, these countries were still not out of the imperialist era in 1952. So that's kind of our next unit, just a little heads up. But the countries in red here are those that we traditionally call third world countries, those in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East. So what do these have to do with what we're talking about? So we know obviously the green are the capitalists, the yellow are the communists. So the Cold War is really between these two. These third world countries, many of whom are gaining independence from the imperial powers, many of whom are just starting to catch on to the industrialization and develop themselves and industrialize, that those countries are kind of up for grabs between the two superpowers, and the US and USSR begin to compete for those countries, which is what we're exploring in this unit. So one thing I want to note about these terms before we move on is that today we don't really use the term like first world and third world other than the examples I already said. But typically if we're talking about as geographers or as historians, we are referring to these countries as developed and developing. So developed and developing. So you can see kind of the same breakdown of countries and same grouping of countries, except we kind of have this orange level here is the like less developed, and the red is the least developed countries. The blue is kind of in transition because they were held backwards for a little bit, and then the darker blue are the developed advanced economies. All right, so what we're talking about today is the first of what is known as proxy wars. So the US, like I was saying, needed to contain communism in the places that it had already taken hold. So the USSR, Eastern Europe, and China were the only communist places. Remember, China was only the second country to kind of voluntarily adopt communism as its economic system. So this whole core right here of communism, they want to contain it and not let it get anywhere else that is red or green. So in other parts of the world, the U.S. needed to find ways to execute this policy without being directly aggressive to the USSR. Remember, this is simultaneous with the arms race and space race. So that nuclear paranoia that we learned about last unit is still persisting here. So they don't want to make them mad enough that they're going to cause nuclear annihilation or actually direct conflict with the USSR, but they want to still try to contain communism. So how do they do this? They fight through what is known as proxy wars, which is a war fought between the US and USSR during the Cold War remotely with proxies or other people fighting for them. So I'm using the example here of Bop 'em Sock 'em Robots, which you might be familiar with, but those are maybe more my era. So this was in part caused by the domino theory, the idea that if one country were to fall to communism, the surrounding countries would soon fall as well, like dominoes. So, because China had already fallen, they needed to start with Southeast Asia, and they were really honing in on trying to contain communism in Southeast Asia, as well as Latin America, which is the next region we're going to talk about. So these Bop 'em Sock 'em Robots, if you're not familiar, let's just imagine this kid represents the US. This kid is this blue robot is his proxy. This kid represents the USSR, and this red robot is his proxy. Now, these two boys are not actually punching each other in the face, so they are not directly attacking each other. In fact, they look like they're having a pretty great time. But these two are actually fighting and attacking each other directly, but they're being controlled by these two little boys. So we can see that the proxy wars are fought between these two powers, such as North Korea and South Korea, like we're going to talk about in a minute, but they're being controlled by the superpowers. So to talk about the beginning of this split. After World War II, Korea was split into North Korea and South Korea along the 38th parallel. Basically, it was a territory that was controlled by Japan, and because Japan had lost, one of the agreements was that Japan would be controlled by the US. Japan's territory, part of it would be taken by the Russians, and part of it would be taken by the United States. So this was divided basically in half along the 38th parallel, or 38th south degrees latitude. And the US and the United Nations kind of controlled South Korea, or governed South Korea, and obviously that meant it was democratic and therefore anti-communist. So as I said, the US also controls Japan at this time. So this is why it made sense that South Korea went to Japan. Also, North Korea does border the USSR. And so remember, this was Japanese territory. The USSR then controls North Korea, which then turns communist because it is influenced by the USSR. So still China is a strong, kind of more independent country than the USSR. They are not a puppet state as the countries in Eastern Europe and North Korea are. So in June 1950, so this is 1 year after China falls to communism, North Korea, with the help of the Soviet Union, invades South Korea. So about 5 years after the end of World War II, 1 year after the fall of China to communism, North Korea is invading, going over that borderline, invades by water and by land, as you can see here, into South Korea. North Korea's leader, Kim Il-sung, wanted to unify the country under communist rule, and he was, of course, supported by the communist Soviet Union at this time. So he wants to take over the entire peninsula, united as one country once again, like it was before the Japanese, and turn it communist. And so he invades, actually, with Russian tanks from World War II. So he does not have his own tanks. So this was not an industrialized place. This was a third world country. So he needs the help and the military prowess of Russia to help invade. South Korea was not prepared for this, and Stalin knew that, and Stalin also thought that Americans would not care to become involved. So the Americans knew that South Korea was economically unstable already, and they were providing them economic and military aid, but they were not really providing enough. So the South Korean army was inefficient and was no match for the well-equipped North. The South Korean army retreated south as the North invaded, all the way down to this region known as Busan here. And Truman, President Truman, still the president, immediately sent U.S. troops to Korea to resist the invasion. So he is seeing that this is a gaping hole and that the South Korean troops basically just got steamrolled by North Korea. So communism definitely needs to be contained because it is spreading. So he puts his best general in charge, of General MacArthur, one of the heroes of World War II, to lead this reinforcement. Here is where Korea becomes a proxy war. So the South starts fighting back. So again, USSR has already provided support for the North. The US is now sending troops to the South, and those are those robots. So the UN also becomes involved and asks for an immediate ceasefire, but the Soviets did not listen to the UN. On June 27th of 1950, the UN Security Council labeled North Korea as an aggressor and offered support to South Korea from UN security forces as well. These were led by MacArthur, so these troops collectively pushed North Korea to Incheon, which is very close to the 38th parallel, as we can kind of see here. So they pushed them all the way back to Incheon using an amphibious invasion. So they kind of pincer it here. So they go up through the east by land and around the west coast here on water. And they continue to push the North Korean troops all the way up to the Chinese border. So this makes China worried, so China sends 1 million volunteers to help North Korea as a response to the U.S. troop invasion. So now we've kind of tug-of-warred it back and forth between South Korea and North Korea, and now the Chinese send another flood of troops into this battle, or into the war, I should say. And this forces MacArthur and the U.S. and UN troops to retreat to the 38th parallel. So now they've retreated and they've advanced, but nobody's getting past here and nobody's getting past here. So this war continues in basically a stalemate right around the 38th parallel for another 2 years. General MacArthur, a couple months into this, gets a little tired and wants to declare war on China as well. But President Truman said no, because he feared another World War III. If we declared war on China, USSR would help them out, and again, we'd have that nuclear annihilation World War III situation. So he wants to liberate China from communist control and use atomic weapons. That's General MacArthur. So Truman says, no, this is a bad idea. But basically, MacArthur tells a congressman in a very public, on-the-record way that he basically is bad-mouthing his commander-in-chief. So General MacArthur is dismissed from his position in April of 1951. So, the next year, Dwight Eisenhower was elected president, and he pledges to end the Korean War. In that time, between when MacArthur is dismissed to the end of the war in 1953, 2 million more soldiers died in Korea. So an armistice was signed between the U.S. and North Korea in 1953. Now, this agreement provided that there would be no more warfare between the two countries, and that there would be a demilitarized zone along the 38th parallel. So no troops could be stationed within the DMZ, not the DMV, but could be and are positioned along either side. So for about 5 miles on either side, there's a demilitarized zone, but right across the border, you can see the troops kind of staring at each other. So they did transfer the prisoners of war back. They were no longer at war, but an armistice is not the same as a peace treaty. So there were no official terms of what's going to happen with this country or what the agreement is, other than we're just going to stop fighting. Still to this day, there has not been a peace treaty to settle this dispute. So here is the demilitarized zone, as I said before. Here it shows it to you on a map. The Korean War is divided ultimately, as it had been before the invasion, when the war, World War II that is, ended. So by the time the Korean War ends, we're still divided along the 38th parallel, more or less. And the 38th parallel is still today one of the most armed places in the world. This shows you the troops that are lining the North Korean side of the 38th parallel. Again, demilitarized zone is an area where no military troops are allowed. So the Korean War is nicknamed the Forgotten War due to other events that occurred in the Cold War that kind of overshadow it. That's kind of why we're just talking about it in a video lesson. Also, it's just kind of a quick thing to bridge the gap between what proxy wars are, as it's the first example, and kind of set the foundation for the rest of our unit here. But many Americans saw zero impact of the war since there was no change in the border between North and South Korea. South Korea is still today a democratic country, and it's still allied with the U.S. North Korea is still a communist country, and I'm sure you've heard about that in popular culture or the news, and it has a totalitarian dictator who's related to the same one that was 65 years ago in the Korean War. But North Korea is kind of an extreme example of a communist totalitarian country because it does not really associate with any other countries and kind of sees everything else as a threat. All right, so that's all we're talking about Korea. We're going to move on to Latin America in the next class.